Matthew19 today. I'm intending just to cover verses 1 through 15. And the main idea here today that I want to sort of draw out from this is, I call it people who change the world for Christ. People who change the world for Christ. Now, when I say that, who do you think of? People who change the world for Christ. Like Martin Luther King Jr.? He did, right? How about William Wilberforce? Or Florence Nightingale, if you know much about her. She loved the Lord. Look what she did. C.S. Lewis. You know, we read books about these folks and certainly enjoy a lot of the fruits of their labors today. But do you know that they all began as ordinary people with just a heart to serve the Lord? And yet, because of their allegiance to Christ with their life and how they invested it, we know them as world changers, right? But what about the person sitting next to you? Or you? You see, this doesn't stop with them. And in the Bible, that is the intent is it isn't just a few, right? That actually God's mission involves all the Christians. And so we come to this chapter here in our Bible, and we're going to receive all sorts of instruction for various places where we find ourselves. You know, we're going to see some instruction on marriage and some on divorce, restrictions on being a parent, and what we're supposed to do when we're kids. You know, single people. It pretty much covers all of us, you know. And to me, that's really great because the idea here is you can change the world in just simple ways that like how you relate to your spouse or how a child may respond to their parent or how a parent might parent their child, or how what a single person does with their daily life. So, all that said is a little introduction here. I want to show you that Jesus talks about three groups who follow simple instructions of His, and that how God will bless your life if you will follow these simple instructions. And we'll begin here with married people. And these married people, I call it, who can change the world. Number one, change the world by staying together. So this is the point that Jesus is driving home here in our first part, is married people who stay together change the world. So let's start here in verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there." Okay, just to kind of catch us up to what's been going on, Jesus has spent most of his ministry in northern Israel. He does kind of come up and down. He goes to Jerusalem for the feasts and things like that. But most of the time, he's in northern. That was kind of his home base, the Galilee, you know. But now he's making his way down to Jerusalem because he's preparing to go to the cross. As a matter of fact, most of the rest of the time that we're in the book of Matthew, he's going to be in and around Jerusalem because these are the last days of his earthly ministry. Even though we've still got, you know, like 10 chapters left, it's not really that long in terms of time in his life and in his ministry. And so we're shown there that he has this great multitude following him around like he usually does. And what does he do with them? He heals them, right? Jesus doing a great work of God there. And you know, the enemy doesn't like this. And Next, that's why we see the Pharisees. Whenever there's a good work going on, the enemy's always looking for a way that he can mess it up. And these Pharisees that come up next, they are some of the Jewish religious leaders of the day. And they oppose Jesus for pretty much everything, don't they? I mean, here they are, supposed to be these godly men, and they could care less about what Jesus is doing for their people who are there spiritually supposed to be, caring for. And all they want to do with him is argue. Argue about little things, argue about the traditions, and so forth. And you know what, quite frankly, that idea persists today, doesn't it? Folks would rather debate than participate in what God's doing and watch him work wonderful things like he's doing there. And we have all that stuff even going on today. So here they come, and it says in verse 3, the Pharisees also came to him, testing him. Remember those two words there, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Okay, testing him is put there for us so that you and I will know that they're not coming to him with genuine questions here. They want to try and trip him up, right? Intending to trap him. So remember what the intent is here. And some of it is because they're losing control over the people. Jesus is growing in fame. There's multitudes following him. People are flocking to him. And no doubt the Pharisees were hearing about it constantly. Jesus is doing this. Jesus is doing that. I mean, imagine if this was today. They would be coming up to the Pharisees. Did you see what Jesus did on social media today? That YouTube video of him healing all those people and everything that he's saying. Why aren't you doing that? And that kind of stuff. Again and again, they're hearing about the miracles and the healings and him speaking grace and truth. And most of what he's talking about opposes their traditions and their teaching and their attitudes. And they just wanted to control people. They wanted to be famous. So there's all this controversy. So I point that out because here comes the opposition trying to disrupt what Jesus is doing. And you know what, you guys? Satan wants to divide God's people just like this. Here's a little clue for us. Because what he wants to do is get people to take sides in matters that aren't really essential. It's one of his key tactics to bring division, that you and I would divide over things that aren't really that important. And he's good at it. And so it's good for us to see these things because we're supposed to be on high alert and not let him bring division between brothers and sisters. So they come to test him, and basically they're saying, let's see if he can answer this question. And the question, go back to verse 3, would you please? The question is, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? Now, why did they ask this? Well, because the law said that you could divorce. The Jewish law, God's law. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, what it says is that a man could divorce his wife if he found any uncleanness in her. So that's not like how we think of cleanliness, right? Like she's not like dirty from dirt, So, but the problem comes in how they interpreted uncleanness, right? And there were two schools of thought. The rabbis interpreted cleanness, if they were conservative in their theology, they would say that you could only divorce on the grounds of adultery. But that grew to be kind of the unpopular way of interpreting uncleanness in Israel. There is the other interpretation of it that the rabbis would say that, and they would put it this way: if a wife lost favor with her husband, he could divorce her. This was the more liberal perspective, more open in interpretation. Like, for example, here's where some of the things that they could divorce for. And you tell me if you think that this is right or not. They could divorce their wife if they just didn't like the way she looked anymore. Or the way that they didn't like the way she cooked. Or if she said something negative about your mother. How about this one? They could divorce their wife if her loud voice could be heard next door. Wow. So this became the more popular view of marriage and divorce, believe it or not. I mean, you could probably believe it because that's kind of like how our culture is today. And so guys were divorcing their wives then for anything, like burning dinner, you know. And the leadership, these guys, are saying that that's good and that's right. What do you think about that? Do you think that's good and right? So that's the question. Can a man divorce his wife for any reason? They say yes. They say no. What do you say, Jesus? Well, how does he respond? Can you look at verse 4 with me? It says, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? Okay, Jesus takes us back to creation. Did you see that, what he did? So they asked about the law. He takes it back before the law to Genesis chapter 1. He's quoting God the Father there speaking. And I want you to notice a couple of times, please, if you would, a couple of things, I should say. First, would you note that Jesus said that God created people? Did you notice that there? He made them. Man, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning? If you're not a creationist here today, know that you're probably going to divide with Jesus over that because Jesus is a creationist. He believed that God made people, that we were created. We didn't evolve. We were created by God. Also, there's one other thing I'd like you to note here that we can imply by what Jesus has said. I think it's pretty plain. He said that Jesus said God made them male and female. Did you notice that? That means God is the one who chose who's a boy and who's a girl. We don't get to choose which one we are, even if somebody says they get to. Right? Because go back, it says it pretty plainly, verse 4, he made them male and female. You know, like I said earlier, I'm Troy. And I don't get to all of a sudden start calling myself Tanya and say I'm a girl. I don't. You know, just because, and I want to be sensitive some with this because I know that some are really confused about this issue. But just because somebody says that a boy can now be a girl, or they even sing it really, really loud, that doesn't make it so, does it? Because God doesn't think that way. You know, let's just remember a few things that our culture used to say were true that are now seem ridiculous to us. Like, did you know that we used to put leeches on ourselves to try and heal ailments? Would you put a leech on you today to try and get some bad blood out of you? Human beings used to do that. I have a picture of an early Tour de France race, and it was right before one of the mountain stages. This is a bike race in Europe, and they used to smoke before they would climb the mountains because they believed that smoking was good for you and it opened your lungs so you could climb better, and in the bike race. And people used to believe that. A lot of people. Right? People used to believe the earth is flat. Lots of people. Right? So just because we believe things, does that make it true? No, it doesn't. So here, going back to creation, what does Jesus say? God made them male and female. So someone might disagree with that, but let's not say that that's what the Bible says, because it doesn't. Well, he continues. He's got more. Verse 5. And he said, he's quoting the Lord again, God the Father. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is so great to me because remember what the Pharisees were asking, right? They wanted to talk about divorce and man's opinion, didn't they? What does Jesus want to talk about? Marriage and God's design. Isn't that great? And so what does he do? He moves him now to Genesis chapter 2. That's what he quoted there. He's just doing a little Bible study here on the spot. And he tells us what the intent was of marriage, at least one of the intents of marriage, and that's that it was like a completion where two people become one. Two people that probably aren't that great by themselves, bring them together, they're better off. I know that's true for my life. You see, in when God made the world, he said it was good in the early chapters of Genesis. But he said that one thing was not good. And that one thing that's not good is that Adam, the first man, was alone. And so what God did, because he's gracious, is he made a helpmate for Adam. Somebody that could be the closest, most intimate friend he ever had. And her name was Eve. And it was the first marriage. Those two became one. And so, according to God's plan and design, they are always one. Even if Adam at some point goes, that's it, I've had enough of you, Eve, I'm going to go find someone else. Well, on the one hand, he couldn't find anybody else because they were the only two people. Sorry, Adam, better love her. Work out your problems. Or it's going to be really a long, lonely life. But really, that's what it is for you and I, Christian. There isn't anyone else. So the two, he says, the man and the woman become one. And just because we talk about this in our culture a lot here, let me just throw another one out here for you. It isn't one man and two women, is it? It's not a man and a man, is it? That's what our culture says. It can be that. But what does God say? God's design for marriage, what he made it to be, is one woman and one man. Is this plain enough for us here? It should be. And I understand that people are confused about this, especially if you don't know the Lord. But the church shouldn't be confused about this because the word is pretty plain. Now, did you see in verse 5 that he added that in order for this oneness to happen, that they have to leave their family? That means their parents, right? He's talking about, I think, the influence that parents have. When you're a child, your parents have a lot of influence over you, right? You got to do what they say. But, when someone comes into your life and when you want to become one with them, well, you have to get out from underneath that, right? You need to move out and do your thing. And sometimes you even need some geographical distance, too. What I think that the Lord wants us to know is that marriage now becomes the most important relationship in your life. More important than any of your friends, more important than your kids, and more important than your parents. The two become one. It shows how serious the matter is. So then, look at verse 6. It says, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Okay, no longer two. And because of that, he says you can't separate them because they're one. The best illustration of this is one that you've probably heard before, but it's like taking two 2x4s, wooden 2x4s, and gluing them together. If you've ever done that, any woodworking, you get some Gorilla Glue, and you glue two 2x4s together, and you clamp them and leave it for a while, a couple months, and then try and tear those 2x4s apart. I've tried it, and what happens is all splinters. It rips it because they're one now, And I bring that up because the Lord is warning us that the damage from divorce is so bad emotionally to people that we're supposed to avoid it at any cost. You almost can't recover from it. I mean, I've done enough counsel with folks over the years to know that some of these things, it's just this wound that never goes away. And God knows that. And so he said what he joins together, people shouldn't separate. You know, whenever I get to preside over a wedding, I quote this verse every single time. Because it's like the last thing I say, as just before I announce them as husband and wife, I say this because that's the expectation. God's bringing them together. They just testified it in front of all these witnesses. And now, don't break up. You know, stay together. And that's why I'm pointing out here the importance of, if you want to be a world changer as a Christian, the simplest place as a married person is to just stay together. It's so important. You almost can't recover from it if you don't. You see, according to Jesus, it's a lifetime commitment. Only death is supposed to separate a couple. Do you understand that? You know, I try to communicate this to couples during premarital counseling, you know, the seriousness of the matter. And but it's funny to me because couples, right before they get married, they don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation often. They're so in love that when I'm talking to them, they sort of look at me like, oh, you're such a cute little pastor, you know, trying to counsel us like that. You know, we got this. We're going to survive on love, you know, and that kind of thing. But then, 6 months later, Pastor Troy, I married Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and, you know, like, who is this person? What's happened? Help. So this is really good. Jesus is raising things to a higher plane, and I love that about him. You know, most people just want like a marriage rule to obey, don't they? Like, how many times, Peter already said it earlier, last chapter, how many times do I have to forgive this person? Can you just give me a number? At what point of frustration can I leave her? That's what people want to know. But what does Jesus say? Marriage is a lifelong relationship. It's a bond. And can I just say before I go on, you know, a strong, healthy, joyful marriage can be one of the greatest witnesses of truth, of the grace of God that there is on earth. So I'm speaking to my married brothers and sisters here. Like, as flawed of a human being as I am, God has used my marriage in ways that were just beyond what I can imagine. And he could do that for anybody. This is like, you could change the world just in your house, you know? If you want to affect people around you, non-Christians, people that are struggling in life, people that are hopeless and lost, you can use your marriage by being victorious and going, you know what, we are just going to stay together and we're going to do what it takes to follow after what God calls us to do. Well, they said to him, look at verse 7, please. They said, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? You see what they're trying to do here? They're trying to pit Jesus against their Jewish hero, Moses. You see, the whole time, the Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, chief priests, they're trying to prove that Jesus isn't the Son of God. And the way that they're trying to do it here is to get him to disagree with the Word of God. And so they're saying, okay, if you say that the plan from the beginning was not to divorce at all, then why did Moses, our hero, say to divorce her? They're like, gotcha. They think they got him. Well, how does Jesus respond to that? Verse 8. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. It wasn't so because, like in Malachi chapter 2, God said, I hate divorce. God doesn't love it, he hates it. But he permits it under certain circumstances. And that was the whole point. But did you see why he permits it? Why does he say there in verse 8 that God permitted divorce? Because of hardness of our hearts, right? You see, again, we're supposed to stay together. But because of the hardness of hearts, there are times, right? He makes a concession because some people can't reach his ideal to stay together and to love each other. But in the beginning, the purpose was to become one, and that's it. Right? And do you guys know that this was largely a protection for the wife? Because again, go back to the ancient world. You know, in the ancient world, it wasn't like today. Women then had a really rough time if they didn't have a husband to provide for them. And think about it. What if men were just tossing them aside when they got tired of them? What would happen? What would become of those gals? So God he loves the ladies. And so he's trying to bless them and help them. And so he allows it, but it has boundaries to it. And that's what he's trying to get across to us here. You know, it's just like a lot of stuff that he allows us to do. I mean, think about stuff that God allows. These are the times when I read stuff like this that I'm reminded that I am a free will person. You see, God has a superior design and desire for my life, but I'm free to choose that or a lesser one. And who's it up to? It's up to me, isn't it? And if I want to have a hard heart, he will let me. But you know, world changers are not hard-hearted people. We want to do it God's way. And so he's telling us, stay together. If you can, stay together. Not everybody can, but we're supposed to. So then in verse 9 he says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her, who is divorced, commits adultery. Okay, let me get a drink of water before I do this one. This is heavy, isn't it? Aren't you glad you're not me right now? Today in the United States, we have what we call no-fault divorce. You guys know that? It basically says that today that nobody has to prove any wrongdoing in order to get a divorce. If you want it, you can have it. Right? It didn't used to be that way, but it is now. But that's not how God sees it. He allows divorce only for what? What did he say? Sexual immorality, right? You guys see that? It's pretty plain. Jesus just told us that any other reason is not right. If someone, here's a little tag there, this is a big one. If someone leaves their spouse for another reason and marries someone else, it's considered by God to be a sin. Why? Because remember, if you go back to what we've just read, in God's eyes, they're still married to the first person. That's why it's considered adultery. Now, you might be thinking right now, I don't like that. I don't agree with that. Well, you're going to have to take that up with God, because that's what it says. And my responsibility is not to apologize for this and just teach it in a kind, truthful way, the best that I can. And then we have to do with that what our conviction is through it. But I'll tell you this, doesn't this raise a whole bunch of other questions? I mean, I've been reading this all week long, and I keep ping, thinking of all sorts of different circumstances that I have questions about. when it comes to this issue of divorce. Like, let me just give you a few of them really quickly. How about somebody who was the innocent one, right? They weren't the one in sexual sin, but they got divorced on these grounds of adultery. Can they get married again? Well, I believe that you can interpret that they are free to marry. They didn't do it, right? They didn't want that. Why should they be restricted from that? Jesus isn't talking about that person. Here's another one. What about somebody who is married and divorced as a non-Christian? And then they get saved and they meet somebody. Can they then be married? Well, Paul the Apostle said in, I think it's 2 Corinthians 5, that if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creation. Old things are past. Behold, all things become new, right? 2 Corinthians 5:21. So, to me, we're forgiven for everything we come to Christ. So why shouldn't that person be allowed to experience Christian marriage? I think they should. And I would marry them. I'd do the ceremony. One more. What about a wife, because this one's coming up a lot in the church, at least the question, not that this happens a lot. But what about a wife who has a violent husband? Am I supposed to tell a frightened woman to just hang in there? Don't leave him no matter what. Am I supposed to? I'm not going to tell her that. I used to think like that, but then I saw some real life stuff. And then I found 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. And we're going to put those up on the screens for you. And I'd like for you just to read along with me, because Paul gives some really good instruction here on, marriage difficulties. Look what he says. It says in verse 10, now to the married I command. So he's talking to a Christian married person. Okay, this is for them. Yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. Okay, so this is going along with Jesus' teaching, right? And what we've been looking at. You're not supposed to get divorced. You're not even supposed to leave. You're supposed to stay together. That's the high road here. That's the gold ring we're supposed to aim for. Don't depart. But even if she does depart, okay, so there's a way out if she really wants to. Let her remain unmarried, he said, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay, so we can interpret this, I think, that Paul says if this gal in this example is miserable because of what's going on with her husband, she can separate from him. She can do that. She's free to do that. I would if he was being violent with me. But according to Paul, and this goes along with what Jesus is teaching, that's not grounds for divorce. According to Jesus, it's not grounds for, remember what the grounds for divorce was? Infidelity. Right? Now, she's not supposed to remarry, he said there, but rather be reconciled, stay together. Somehow that guy needs to repent and turn and be the husband that he's supposed to be and not a scary man. And someone needs to get in his face. Now, why does this have to be like this? Well, remember, two are one now. As far as God is concerned, they're still married. So before I move into our next part here, I know these are hard things. But let's go back with the main idea that I was talking about when we started. If we married people were really serious about wanting to change the world, we would have a high view of marriage like God does. And we could start by staying together. You see, Jesus is letting us know divorce is not a solution to a problem. Our culture thinks divorce is a solution to the problem, and it's not. You know what the solution is? Dealing with the hard hearts. That's what needs to happen. Now, is there grace for those of us who've really blown it in the past? You bet there is. If you've made a train wreck of things back there, there's nothing you can do about that. I think that what we do is we live for Jesus today. Do I sit there and go, should I even have married that person? And I don't know, maybe I should split up. No, don't do that. Live for Jesus today. There's grace for everything that we've done. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin. It's not. In the church, you can start to think that it is, but it's not. The rejection of the Holy Spirit drawing us to Christ, that's the unforgivable sin. It's the only thing Jesus said that would not be forgiven. So the Lord is urging us here to give our whole marriage to God. There's so much hope when we do. God can transform your life, can transform your marriage if you will let him. Okay, so that's the married folks. Now as we move into the second part, here we're going to look at singles that can change the world, and it's through being content with Jesus. So number 2, singles change the world through being content with Jesus. So let's talk about you single folks, okay? Verse 10, his disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Anybody else think this is kind of funny? Not what we've been talking about up till now, but this first. Like I read this and I'm thinking, the disciples are like, wow, I'm not getting married if I gotta be, if it's that serious, you know. It seems like they understand the commitment here. It's not supposed to be entered into lightly, and good for them. And I think that's how it should be for all of us. We shouldn't enter into marriage lightly. I don't forbid people to be married, but boy, I try to raise the awareness of how serious it is, because it is serious. Well, he talks about singles next, at least in my impression. Let's look at verses 11 and 12 together. Here's how Jesus responds to that statement. And he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there were eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Okay, eunuchs is basically a castrated man, okay? And so Jesus is using this statement that the disciples make to teach them about something. And I think it's really instructive for us, especially if you're a widow or a widower, or you're a young person and you'd like to be married someday, or you're single right now, single young man or woman. I know that looking around the room, there's a bunch of you here, and there's some good instruction for you here, because Jesus states that there's 3 reasons why men don't have sexual relations with women. Well, how does that relate to me if I'm single? Well, just bear with me for a minute. The first way, he says, that if you're born that way, meaning that there was some sort of physical condition where you couldn't, have intimacy with someone else. He says there's some of those people. And then secondly, he said there's ones who have been castrated by someone else, right? Because again, going back to the ancient world, that it was a common practice for kings to castrate all the males who were around their harems, right? They would do that. You see that if you read through the book of Esther or Daniel. There's a lot of talk about eunuchs in those 2 books, because that's what they did, especially in the Medo-Persian Empire. Then the third reason he's saying that men don't have relations with women is that there are those who willingly give that up for God. And this is what I want to talk about with you here today. There's some people who live their life celibate for the kingdom of God, and it's a good thing. They could marry, Jesus says, but they chose not to. And he says, look, some can accept this, and if they can, great, and if you can't, then that's fine too. I was talking to this young guy a couple of years ago, I remember, and he was a single guy, and I asked him, so are you going to stay single? He was probably mid-20s at the time. Are you going to stay single, or would you like to be married? someday. And he goes, oh, I can't be single. I'm getting married for sure, And so that guy is not what Jesus is alluding to here. Some can give up marriage and family life for the Lord. Most can't. I couldn't. But maybe there's a few of you who are considering that. Well, let me remind you of something that may not be evident on the surface. And that's that Paul the Apostle in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 told us that the single Christian life was superior. Do you know that? When you get a chance, just for some homework, especially if you're a single person, go and read this about the second half of 1 Corinthians 7. You could read the whole chapter because the first half is about married life, and the second half is about single life. And Paul is talking about both of them and how we're to be, as I call today, world changers by where we are in our life. And I say this because sometimes living in Meridian, if you're a single person, you can be made to feel like it's an inferior thing, Because, let's just be honest, everything in this town is like family extravaganza, isn't it? Everywhere you look, family this, family that. But in that chapter, Paul argues that a single person can devote more fully themselves to God than a married person can. Because you don't have to care about pleasing a spouse. You can just live free of responsibilities of a family and a spouse and live to please the Lord. So my point with this second area is that you single folks, I want to just encourage you because you can be a powerful force for changing our world for Christ. Because you can live devoted to Him. That you would be, as Paul says in that chapter, just be content with where you are. Even if you want to be married, be content right now with your life with Jesus and serve Him with everything that you've got. I've had a few conversations with people over the years who are now married and have kids and all that, and they think, man, I wish I would have lived more for Jesus when I was single. Because now I've got 3 or 4 kids, and I'm cooking meals in the kitchen all day long. I can never leave the house. And it's not like they're mad or anything, or they don't want those kids. They love them. But it's just like, I wish I would have devoted myself in that moment to live fully for Him. And that's really what the Holy Spirit just wants everybody to do. If you can receive it. If not, then go get married. Okay, we're going to look at one more group here, and these are the kids. We're going to look at children that can change the world, and the children can change the world, number 3, by just going to Jesus. Okay, remember, all 3 of these are simple. Stay married, right? Live simply for Jesus as a single person, or go to Jesus as a child. Verse 13, it says, then little children were brought to Him, that He might put His hands on them and pray. But the disciples rebuked them. I try to picture myself in these scenes sometimes in my mind's eye, and I picture myself watching the disciples like, okay, folks, stay back. Keep those kids away from Jesus. Just stay back. He's too busy. We're talking about adult stuff here, theology. Those kids, they're just running around, They're like the proverbial old man with the hose in his front yard, get off my lawn, spraying them, That's how I picture them, kind of in that moment. And obviously that's not a good picture for people, especially disciples. Now here's, I think, one of the most interesting things about these last few verses, and that's that this whole discussion about kids comes right after the discussion about divorce. That Matthew follows up the divorce and marriage stuff with kids. Do you think that this is here by accident like that? I don't. It's probably here because sometimes the people that are most affected by marriage breakup are the kids. As a matter of fact, I think that kids are highly affected by whatever kind of marriage that we have. Do you have a Do you have a healthy one? Then those kids are going to feel safe and secure and comforted. They will know how to resolve conflict when they get married and those kind of things. It's a secure environment for those little guys. But what about if it's an unhealthy marriage that they witness? Well, those kids will suffer in all kinds of ways, I think. I was the child of a divorced family. Could I just, by a show of hands, you don't have to if you don't want to, but if you will, if you are a child of a divorced family, could you raise your hand? Did you guys do that? That's a lot of you. Third, maybe, more. It's a lot. But you know, God can do things through that. God did something wonderful in my life, but it didn't start out that way. And boy, I bet if all of you that had your hands up, if I went around and just had you stand up, I won't. But if I did and have you stand up and just describe some of the trauma that you experienced from your parents' divorce, the stories we would hear would be really bad. I know mine is. So I say all that because one of the biggest hindrances to kids going to Jesus is the parents. Because we just can't get along. Because we won't stay together. Because I'm so wrapped up in myself and my selfishness that I just ignore what's going on with them. And it shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't get in the way. Rather, like this is here, don't be like the disciples. Be like how Jesus is saying, make it easy for the kids to go to him. Have genuine faith. Learn how to resolve your challenges. Have grace in your parenting. It's so hopeful for the young ones to know that they have that at home. Well, let's finish here, verses 14 and 15. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And he laid his hands on them and departed from there. This is so great. Jesus is approachable for anyone, isn't he? Even little kids, especially little kids. The best churches and the best parents make it simple and easy for kids to get to know God. That's part of your role, parent. I'm just talking to you again if you're parents. One of your biggest roles is just to make it simple and easy for your kids to go to the Lord. And how you portray in your marriage, like who God is through just being just and gracious and kind and treat those young people with respect. That you would have joy in the Lord so then they can have hope in who God is and what he can do. and remember, the kids don't belong to us. They're on loan to us. Children belong to the Lord. They're a gift. And so this is a big responsibility. You think marriage is a big responsibility. Having children is a huge one. I like how Damian Kyle put it. He's a pastor of Calvary Chapel Modesto, and I was listening to his commentary on this chapter, and he said, if there's one thing that you get right, is to bring your child to Jesus. If you don't do anything else right, make sure that you make it easy and simple for your child to go to Jesus. I mean, we can have a lot of other goals for our kids. We have goals for our kids. But don't get this one wrong. Because God is pretty fired up about this. He wants the children to freely come to him. And then adults would not get in the way. Because think about it. Think about the impact that God, a free path to God and his relationship with those kids, what that might have in their life later. It's going to be huge. And their capacity to be the next generation of world changers. We want to make this, keep the barriers out of it. So, as I wrap up here, You can start by, I'm going to speak to the married couples one more time. You can start by staying married. Do what you have to do. You know, if you need help, will you just promise me to go get help? See somebody that will help you with your marriage. Don't pretend. You know, I have a friend who quietly suffered for like 20 years, pretending that it was fine, and it was horrible and got worse and worse and worse the whole time. And it didn't need to be like that. See a pastor, one of us pastors. You know, one of the things that helped my wife and I when we first got married, because my wife and I are very stubborn people. And, you know, we are, it was hard because when we got married, God brought two people together who are sinners, and we won our way. And so our first year was like, you know, things exploding, and it wasn't good. But you know what we did? We went into a small group at our church, and we were around other married couples. And we discovered how to solve problems and not just keep it to ourselves and be real with others. And it helped us. It was one of the things that God used to give us a healthy marriage. And I would just urge you, if you are struggling with those things, that you would try that. You try it. Don't just keep it to yourself. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. The other person is just gone off the edge. But we can do what we can do, right? I can't change my spouse. You can't change your spouse, but you can do it yourself. And that's all God calls us to be responsible for, is what we can do. And don't beat yourself up over the past. There's nothing you can do to change it, but you can just receive God's grace and live for today. Whether you're a young person, a single person, or a married person, I urge you to walk in the Spirit that way. Would you stand with me, and we'll pray, and I'll invite the worship team back up for one more song.